Good afternoon to everyone here and to those that are online. Many of us today have come from various parts of the world, literally. Some that are physically here, and there's others that are virtually here, to give tribute to a life well lived, to Dr. David Scott, humbly known as David. Husband, father, grandfather, teacher, elder, friend, and colleague. And I want to say that a lot of love has gone into formulating this service with words, music, and poetry. And the Scott family is honored to share and welcome everyone to this service to honor David Scott. And for those of you who are Riderwood residents, I just want to let you know that this service will be longer than the traditional 45 to 60 minute service. It will last about an hour and 15 minutes. And I thought how wonderful it is to be able to say that and know that David would want us to say that as well, to welcome us and say, have a relaxed atmosphere. I want you to be comfortable and above all, very, very welcome. So welcome. And now I'd love to start with a call to worship, and then if we would all join, and those of you who are around the world, if you know this song, join with us. To God be the glory. But now for a call to worship that I will say for us all. All is from God. All things are in God. In the beginning, there is grace far preceding time and space. In the shaping, there is grace, tireless working in each place. In the turmoil, there is grace, underwriting every race. At the ending, there is grace, superseding that time and space. All is from God. All things move towards God. And God gives the glory. So let us stand and raise our voices together. The words are in your bulletin, and we will sing this song that has special memories for the Scott family. Amen. You may be seated. And now we have the opportunity to hear three family memories, and I'm going to ask those three members to just come forward one after the other without any further introduction, okay? And I wanted to make sure too we use this mic and we take, as Wisely has done, take it. Yeah, great, thanks.
So I'm Robert Scott. When Nathan called to tell us that David had died in the hospital, Elfie and I sat quietly for a long moment. And then both of us said, through tears, virtually the same thing to each other. David was such a truly good person. I've thought about that moment often since his death. What does it mean, really, that someone is a truly good person? In many ways, the description is much too capacious. For sure, my big brother David was deeply spiritual, and thus he spent much of his life thinking about others, both individually and collectively. He was warm, genuine, loving, empathetic, kind. All those words apply. Yet he was certainly not saintly. He had a temper. He could be impatient. But having thought a lot about what it means to be a truly good person, I realized that good only has meaning in context. And for me, the context was simply this. David was my adored big brother who was always there. An early memory takes me back to Landour, India in September of 1951. I was 7 and David was 16. Our mother, Carol, was 9 months pregnant, about to deliver soon our youngest brother, Douglas. My father, Roland, was 1,000 miles away at a conference in Nagpur. It was a standing joke in our family that whenever anything significant happened to the family, Roland was never there. But David was. Contractions began at 4 a.m., and David arranged for the dandy and escorted mother to Landauer Community Hospital. My brother Gordon and I waited with growing apprehension throughout the entire day and into the evening. Finally, we both went to bed. My vivid memory is David shaking me awake at 5 a.m., more than 24 hours after he had left with Mother. "Bob," he said, "you have a beautiful baby sister." Now, one can still forgive him for misidentifying Douglas's gender. After all, he had been without sleep for the entire time. And I still remember going back to sleep, happy in the knowledge that all was well. David was there. Some years later, it's 1955, and our family is leaving India to return to the United States. We had a furlough, and the family was scheduled to spend the year in Albion, Michigan, where David was attending his junior year in college. But we faced a problem. How are we to get the family to Michigan? Not to worry, David was there. He met us at the pier in New York with his solution to the problem. He had purchased a 1953 Ford sedan from a used car dealer in Richmond, Indiana, drove it all the way to the pier in New York City, and we all set off to Albion in grand style. That year in Albion was a difficult one for our family. It was a tough town with tense town-gown relations. Moreover, Roland, my father, was spending most of the year visiting Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and Jordan. That part of Michigan was known as Tornado Alley. And sure enough, one day in the spring, we were alerted to a nearby funnel cloud. Roland was in Lebanon, of course. But David rushed Gordon, Douglas, Mother, and me out of our beds. We huddled in a small room under the stairs. Finally, there was an all clear, and we emerged to see that actually the tornado had touched down on 2 houses just across the street. Fortunately, no one was seriously injured, and in any case, we were never at risk because David was there. Now, many more stories could fill all the time we have together here today, but the theme remains the same. Years later, David was there to visit Buffy and me in Williamsburg while I was in law school. In order to see us, he had to reschedule his scheduled flight from New York to Delhi by flying down to Newport News, Virginia, so we could enjoy a wonderful weekend touring the Yorktown battlefield. Forward just a few more years, and Buffy, Bob, and our 2-year-old daughter Christy were spending the summer at Exeter University in England. But David was there. He had rerouted his flight through London, and we spent a wonderful evening at a great Indian restaurant, where the Indian waiters spoke a language that David, the linguist, could not identify. He called them over. "What language are you speaking?" he asked. They looked a bit sheepish. Then one of them said, "Bengali." "Ha!" David snorted. "That's not any Bengali that I ever heard." And off they went, unwilling to admit that, having recently been expatriated from Kenya, they were in fact speaking an African dialect. As the years went by, we relished in our engagements with both families, and after David and Corinne settled in D.C., we cherished our bi-monthly trip by train from New York in Amtrak to attend Arena Stage together. And we would arrive at Union Station each time, knowing that David would be there, waiting to meet us. Over these last years, filled with wonderful memories, the relationship evolved into one of equal friendship. But for me, it always remained the same. He was always my big brother, and he was always there.
Thank you, Bob. My uncle. So I'd like to now share, I'm Nathan, David and Corinne's son. And I'd like to share some of my memories of growing up with my father. But before I do, I'd like to start by reading a poem by Kabir, one of my father's favorite poets. Fullness by Kabir. He who is meek and contented, he who has equal vision, whose mind is filled with the fullness of acceptance and of rest, he who has seen him and touched him, he is freed from all fear and travail. To him, the perpetual thought of God is like sandal paste smeared on his body. To him, nothing else is delight. His work and his rest are filled with music. He spreads the radiance of love. Kabir says, touch his feet, who is one and indivisible, immutable and calm, filling all vessels to the brim with ecstatic joy, whose form is love. Where do I even begin to share my memories of my father? As I stand before you, I imagine him here now, speaking to all of you. As a pastor and preacher, university professor, worship leader, he was comfortable speaking in public. If I close my eyes and put my hands on the podium like this, I can see him here, hear the cadence of his voice, feel the rapt attention of his listeners. I hope that I can do him justice with what I have to say this afternoon. When I think of my father, words are what come to mind. He loved words. Om, the word that created the world. The cosmic Christ. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. But the words that come to mind for me, words that describe my Father, are humility, generosity, and curiosity. David Scott was anything but a braggart. Rather, he was a deeply humble man, a scholar of Indian religions with a PhD in the study of the 15th century mystic poet Kabir. He would always listen to what others had to say on the subject of religion before sharing his own thoughts. He was a fluent Hindi speaker who could read the sacred texts in Sanskrit to you. And yet, when native Hindi speakers heard him, they would ask, "Oh, do you speak Hindi?" And he would always respond, "जी हाँ, बोल लेते, टूटी फूटी हिंदी तो बोल लेते." Loosely translated, that means, "Yes, I speak a little broken Hindi." I have to confess that I loved to watch this exchange because it happened so regularly. And my father delivered his response so humbly and yet so exquisitely that his listeners' jaws would often drop and their eyes would get big. "My goodness, you speak Hindi better than we do." To which my father would simply smile and say nothing more. Besides his humility, I think of his generosity. He was generous with his time, with his love, with his praise. I always remember that when we would come home from boarding school on our vacation, he would be sure to spend as much time as he could with us. We were on vacation, but he was still working at the university, teaching classes and grading his students' work. But every night was game night when we were at home. And regardless of what he had to do, he would join us for cards, for Yahtzee, or Monopoly, or whatever game we wanted to play. And my father was never short on praise. He regularly told us how much he loved us and how proud he was of us and our accomplishments, regardless of how mundane they were. As a young adult finding my way in the world, I knew that I could count on my father's support. He might question why I was making certain choices, but his generous and loving support was always there. And finally, I think of his curiosity. He was an intensely curious man, interested in just about everything. He was curious about what his sons were interested in, curious about your thoughts on just about any subject, curious about other cultures and their religious practices. We always had 2 books by the dining room table, a Webster's Dictionary and a book of word origins, because the dinner time conversation inevitably led to looking words up. "What does that word mean?" my father would say. "And what is its origin? Does it come from Latin or Greek or Sanskrit? Look it up and let's see," he would say. My father's curiosity was not simply intellectual. He was curious about the world, which gave him an incredible sense of adventure. Growing up, just about every Christmas vacation and every summer holiday, we would go on a family trip someplace, a new family adventure, whether within India or traveling back and forth between India and the United States, sometimes stopping in Korea, Japan, the Philippines, or Singapore, or alternately Greece, Turkey, Germany, Sweden. We were always exploring someplace new. In their later years, my parents continued their adventures on trips to Australia, to Peru, to Mexico, to Scandinavia, to Central Asia. And do you think these were beach holidays? No, they were not. They were adventures to get to know the cultures, the people, the myths, the languages, the religious practices, the art. My father's curiosity enriched his life and our lives beyond measure. And so, as I think about my father's legacy, I think about what I want to carry forward and pass on to my children. There are so many aspects of him which I value and cherish and try to nurture so that I can pass them on. Was my father perfect? No, he was not. Are there choices he made that I wish he had not made? Yes, there are. But if I can be half as humble, half as generous, half as curious, and half as adventurous as he was, I will know that I have carried his legacy on. Thank you, Dad, for modeling a life well lived. Your son, Nathan.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's amazing to see a whole room full of people that have love and appreciation, and it feels great in my heart. I'm going to read a poem that is from one of his good friends, and it is titled "A Pilgrim." We remember today a gentleman, a pilgrim, one who encountered and sought out always in the moment the kingdom of heaven. He knew that whatever mattered is incarnate, is here, now, with you and me, immediate. He knew that we are called to exalt and be radiant as a child is radiant, basking in the light of this moment. Now, he believed in a God who filled the hungry with good things, the spirits alugobi, dal, and rice. Yeah, and that kind of brings me to where my first memory of him, and is a fond one. I was about 4 years old. We were in India, and every weekend we'd go to the swimming pool and we'd take the bus. And I remember this weekend we were late to get out the house, probably my fault, and we missed the first bus. And I remember the first thing on his face wasn't, distempt or disgust, or he just looked at us like, oh, well, we get to walk now, and big smile on his face. And I was like, but, my parents are here bickering, oh, we missed the bus, and here he is just focusing on the pure things in life, just taking a stroll down the street. And those memories continue to my last memory of him, playing a board game nonetheless. And just the entire time, he was just filled with smile. And I remember some people around the table didn't believe that he knew how to play the game. And the smile, he looked to me and smiled, and I knew he knew how to play the game. And he was just another one of his jokes and antics. And all the time, everyone think he didn't, and he was the one winning the game. So, and just laughter and something that is very, is rare to find, someone that is a pure soul, someone that can find happiness and light in darkness, and someone that doesn't dwell on the dark things because they have seen so much light. And to grow up with a grandfather whose love and compassion was always showing. He was never afraid to show his compassion. He was never afraid to tell someone they're proud of you. And again, sometimes when it's hard to find pride in oneself, he would never shy away from it. He would always acknowledge anything to be proud of, even if it was just getting up and having breakfast that day or anything. Just keep moving forward. And I think those little things is really what I appreciated about him the most, and it carried on to in the way that he carried himself. And he was a very religious man, and for someone who wasn't very religious growing up, I didn't always like doing the dinner prayer, but the words that was in that prayer were not of preaching, of judgment, of repentance. It was more of pleasure and enjoyment, the sun and the rain and the apple trees, and enjoying our earth. And that carried himself, throughout his entire life. He cared so much for so many different things: environmental justice, women's rights. And it's so amazing to have that impact when you're a young child, to see someone who is filled with joy and filled with love, and that teaches you that it's okay to be different. It's okay to think differently. You know, I remember maybe around 11, he found out that I was agnostic, and the first thing wasn't like, oh, you don't believe in God. He was just wondering, you know, what do you think of God, and what do you think of spirituality, and what is your inclination? And for me, you know, someone that has been agnostic for a while, I always find spirituality around me. And he might be gone from this earth, but he is not gone from our hearts. He is not gone from our memories, and he's not gone from our spirit. And I will always remember him as a kind soul who always had a pleasant word to say to you in your darkest time. And he was someone that cared for you no matter what. His compassion reached the end of the earth, and as I stand here and I recite this, and I know that he is watching over all of us, and his love is in all of our hearts, and his compassion is in all of our hearts, and I will carry that to my last day. And the last thing I have to say that he'd always tell me is that I was a gentleman and a scholar, and there was very few of us left, and that was a legacy that I will continue to live, to be a gentleman, to be a scholar, and to be both. Thank you.
All of those words were wonderful. Thank you. Just an inspiration just to hear the three of you. Thank you so much. I wish we could just sort of give everybody, I saw you all doing this, that's what I wish we could do. Well, we are now in a time to sing another wonderful hymn that the family loves, and that is "Great is Thy Faithfulness." So if we could stand together and we will sing, and again, those words are in your bulletin.
There is no shadow turning with
You may be seated. And just like we did with the family, it's time for friends' memory, and if those four as well will just come one after the other. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Philip Lutkendorf. When my family and I first came to stay in the Himalayan hill resort of Mussoorie in May of 1980 to escape the sweltering heat of Delhi, where I had been studying Hindi, we quickly learned that the Anglo-American missionary families who also summered there were not a homogeneous group. Representing various denominations and many individual persuasions, they were on a spectrum from, so to speak, right to left. From Bible-pounding conservatives out to save the souls of the heathen from hell, to progressive and tolerant liberals devoted to interreligious understanding and dialogue. As our warm and welcoming landlady, a Mennonite missionary, Riley remarked, "There are folks up here praying for my soul." They were almost certainly praying for Corinne and David Scott as well, or possibly had given up doing so, whom we soon met after this, who were emphatically in the far left wing of the missionary scene. Corinne working in a collective that sought to empower and improve the economic lives of low-caste urban women, and David trying to teach often narrow-minded Indian seminarians to have more respect and appreciation for the complexity and spirituality of the non-Christian religious communities, Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, that were all around them. I recognized David immediately as a generous and loving man, and also as a kindred spirit who seemed like a bade bhai, a big brother to me. A fluent Hindi speaker who had grown up in India, he had earned a PhD in South Asian Studies, religious studies with a South Asia focus, the graduate program I was then pursuing, and had written a dissertation on the Hindi poet Saint Kabir. Mine would later be on Kabir's near contemporary and sometime critic, the Hindi poet Saint Tulsidas. When David and I met, we always had lively conversations on scholarship and Indian studies, and over the years we shared many academic friends in common. Besides seeing and socializing with the Scots over several summers in Landour, Mussoorie, my wife also visited them in Jabalpur, and I later in Bangalore, enjoying their generous hospitality. And this continued after their retirement and move to Washington, D.C. I regularly attended professional meetings there and would often stay with Corinne and David in their lovely townhouse, filled with reminders of India, and enjoying its proximity to the metro, the mall, and the city's great museums. But most of all on these visits, I enjoyed and basked in their love. In his later years, and we continued to connect via Zoom periodically after the pandemic began, David would often express this verbally to me at the end of a conversation: "We love you very much." It was said with real feeling, and it always made my heart glow. Like all of you, I miss this wonderful man and treasure my memories of him. But I know that he had, and was gratefully and happily aware of having had, a truly blessed life of giving and receiving love.
My name is Maya Malhotra, and I'm an ex-Woodstock alum as well. And that's how I got to know the Scots so very well. The last time we met was at Brookside Gardens, and David was pushing his sporty red walker. The characteristic warm and affectionate smile lit up his face. It took a while for our mutual recognition to dawn of the masked faces, but the twinkle in his eye and the smile in Corinne's eyes gave them away. That's why it's hard to accept that he is no more. I guess that it was time after a life of giving and seeking. David, I learned, was a loving child of India and America. To hear David's Hindi, just as one of his family said earlier, with its unassuming perfection, warmed the cockles of the heart. He was senior to me at Woodstock. His younger brother Gordon was my classmate. It was at our WOSAR events that I got to know the Scots well. At our monthly curry club, we were regulars. And at working together for our Virginia reunion a few years ago, Woodstock exerted a strong bond between us. We ran into each other at so many cultural Indian events of music and dance concerts at the Smithsonian, at the Gandhi Center. So then I asked the Woodstock and the Scots to join the Asian American Forum. I felt that not only would they enjoy it, the events and the activities, but that the forum would be enriched by their lifetime of identification with India. And of course, as happens at cultural organizations, they were fast and happily promoted to the board. Nathan wrote that his father was a seeker. India drew David back after a childhood living at the roots, at the Mufassil level, where the missionaries worked for years on end, and in those days, where 90% of India then lived. And in the hills, the familiar term we used for the Himalayas, where our school was located. Once you've lived in the hills, overlooking that beautiful and broad dune valley, and seeing forever on a clear monsoon day, beyond the Sivaliks, the endless curved expanse of the great Indian plains, on the other side, from the crest, you can see the massive high Himalayas, which are awe-inspiring, a wall of ice and snow which has commanded the Indian imagination for millennia, for eternity. All this touched David. I recently found 3 essays that he had written in 2012 for the Asian American Forum anthology. They reveal a charming, self-deprecating sense of humor and a gift for insight, tolerance, and nuance which escapes most people. Before then, had no idea that he was the lyricist of two of our most loved Woodstock school songs, which we sang in gusty unison at all our reunions. Both anthems celebrate the sublime beauty which surrounded us, the Deodar valleys, the cold, clear blue skies of spring, and the winding trails of the Teri Garhwal range of Uttarakhand. David partook of India. He was the earnest student of Hinduism who fell full tilt into the boisterous bacchanalian merriment once of Holi, a festival which loosens all inhibitions. It's a vivid, colorful melee of technicolor confrontation, men and women, all the different social classes, each armed for attack with water guns and spilling buckets. Loaded, the ammo was colored water and colored powders. David fell into the heart of Holi, starting at midnight under a full spring moon. Crossroads were lit with fires to burn the wicked demoness Holika and rid mankind of evil. From David's essay, Nothing is Forbidden, from boys and girls who dunk each other in mud ponds, a woman chasing a man, presumably her husband, with a stick, loudly berating him for his unsatisfying sexual activity. Wow, all this did not escape David's notice. Holy merriment is much fueled with thandai, a deceptively delicious cooling blend of milk, almonds, cardamoms, and a generous quantity of bhang, which is marijuana. Thus did David Scott, the quoting his words, the naive Western academic researcher morphed, in his own words, into a bemused, blabbering idiot. David pitched full membership in the ranks of Young India. Bura na mano, holy hai. All is forgiven, David. Don't mind, it's holy. Some years later, he earned an even higher award. In Bollywood slang, it means going from zero to hero. He became a celebrity uncle. Corinne and he had undertaken a wild bus journey by night from Udaipur to Mount Abu, from where they were going to proceeding to Mount Abu to see these 11th, 12th century fantastic Jain temples. Anyway, they went on this deserted Kacha road, unpaved, not even road metal probably. Not quite deserted was the route. The bus was waylaid by dacoits or bandits. They had placed boulders across the road and then chucked rocks through the windows and the windshield. Everybody ducked down. Orders were given to hand in watches, wallets, and valuables. The bus driver absconded with the dacoits. And leaving the holidaying families scared and stranded in the wilderness, all looked towards Uncle. That's, as anybody who's been to India knows, it's a very respectful title to address one's seniors. Nobody else could drive. All chanted, Uncle, Uncle. Uncle David had in his long ago youth driven a small truck. Well, in the pitch dark on that rocky, bumpy track, Uncle managed to get the passengers to a place of safety. They spent the rest of the night in a dharamshala, which is a pilgrim's rest stop, and sleeping makeshift on 2 tabletops. However, David's renown as a foreign savior spread at Abu Road and even into Rajasthan's main Hindi newspaper. The headline proclaimed, Pardesi ne Bharatiya bus ko bachaya. A foreigner saves an Indian bus. With such adventures and daring do, with such tales of adventure and insight, David and Corinne, in our next life, in the hereafter, I would love to join you, in David's words, with a pack on my back, with a friend who's true, let me hit that winding trail and go trekking along with you.
Dear Corinne, Kevin, Chris, Nathan, members of the family, and all friends, we are gathered here to be tellers of tales, and we have been invited to participate in the story at a new level. Some of you will recognize those phrases as the title of one of David's articles, examining the deep structures of religious ways of thinking in Vidya Jyoti, tellers of tales, to participate in the story at a new level. And I'm grateful for this time to reflect briefly on my colleague at the United Theological College in Bengaluru, and then my friend here in the United States. David and Corinne invited my family to spend our first Christmas in the USA with them. David, who is now participating in the story at a new level. In his 1954 book, The Wonder That Was India, A.L. Basham surveyed the history and culture of the Indian subcontinent before the coming of the Muslims. For David, India was perpetually a wonder, not a wonder that was, but a wonder that is. Unlike Basham, who looked back to the wonder before another great world religion irrevocably altered what India had been, David was enchanted by the India that was home to many world religions, not least the synthesis that the Hindu-Muslim encounter had led to. This enchantment was not one of superficiality that was content with shallow slogans. No, this was the enchantment born out of pragmatic realism, recognizing that while the great religions had enormous potential for good, there was always the reality that the interreligious encounter could lead to violence and hatred. And in the last 10 years, he was agitated about the rapid breakdown of civility, dignity, curiosity, and harmony, and did not hesitate to voice out what he saw as a descent to rabid forms of pseudo-nationalism. The pragmatic, realistic enchantment was a hallmark of his teaching and studying of religion and communicating his insights to cohorts of students who came from all over India and other parts of the world to Bengaluru. At UTC, he stood in the long line of great teachers of religion: Paul Devanandan, Stanley Samartha, Herbert Jaising, G.D. Melanchthon, Eric Lott, among others. He recognized that the concept of dialogue was pioneered in this college and continued to foster its practice even as things were changing all around. Rather than indulge in the futile partisan identity political games within such a setting, he focused on the primary task of the theological teacher to model the reality, as another Methodist, Stanley Hauerwas, put it, that Christians believe that through cross and resurrection, we have been given the time to be patient in a world of impatience. That meant, even if he was impatient, he had to be patient as leadership struggles and regionalism swirled around us, as the so-called great traditions coming from the Sanskrit legacy were challenged, and rightly so, as Dalit, tribal, feminist, and ecological priorities remade the task of theological education in India. At a time when there was a clamor for either or, patience meant the ability to process things with sensitivity and courage, with understanding and insight, with grace and appreciativeness, without betraying one's convictions and commitments. Among many things that opened my eyes to David's patient presence and ongoing enchantment with India was his superb and brilliant article, The Return of the Goddess, where in prescient tones he gives us an overview of the goddess tradition down the ages amidst dominant patriarchy, and points out that while the feminist movement, including Christian feminists, would do well to pay heed to what the recovery of the goddess tradition meant, it would have to do this recognizing the overlay of the insidious will to power amidst culturally valued goals and activities. The essay concluded with the almost mystical words that at first glance seemed to be far from the pragmatic realist that David was, but bear testimony to his enchantment. The gracious, empowering matrix, she in whom we live, move, and have our being. She comes, she is here. Earlier, I mentioned the attempts at fruitful synthesis that the Hindu-Muslim encounter had led to, and I want to conclude with the words of one such synthesizer, someone whose writing David had devoted a large part of his intellectual enchantment to Kabir, who says, I have known in my body the sport of the universe. I have escaped from the error of this world. The inward and the outward are become as one sky. The infinite and finite are united. I am drunken with the sight of this all. This light of thine fulfills the universe, the lamp of love that burns on the tray of knowledge. Kabir says, there error cannot enter, and the conflict of life and death is felt no more. Kabir says, there error cannot enter, and the conflict of life and death is felt no more. And so we bid farewell to this enchanted man who now dwells in perpetual enchantment where the conflict of life and death is felt no more.
I'm Robert Cohn, a friend and Riderwood neighbor. It's an honor and a privilege to have a chance to say a few words about David. Like everyone here, I wish I had more years with him. David and Corinne moved to Riderwood a little over 3 years ago, and Ruth and I were fortunate to have them as next-door neighbors. We spent much of the fall in California with family and did not immediately get to know the Scotts. When we finally got together for dinner, there was immediate rapport. You know how you meet someone for the first time and feel like you've known each other much longer? I think had David and I met 70 or 80 years ago, we would have become lifelong friends. And I suspect David may have felt the same way. We invited Corinne and David to join a group that met every other week to discuss articles in the New Yorker, and David's comments were always measured, thoughtful, and insightful, and much appreciated by the other participants. David's role in the group reflected his values, his scholarship, and candor. He emanated warmth and caring. David was one of the least pretentious people I ever knew in his openness, receptivity to others, and modesty. Over the past year or two, I had taken to writing satirical political verse, which I shared with friends and acquaintances at Riderwood and elsewhere. David was always among the first to give me feedback, thoughtful and encouraging. His affirmation had particular meaning for me. Thank you, David. When David was in great pain and distress, he never complained. There was never a sense of self-pity, never a, why me? He was stoical and I think accepted life as it unfolded. Every individual among the billions on our earth has an impact on others. In Judaism, there is an expression, tikkun olam. Loosely translated, it means repair the world, mend the world, heal the world. David was the embodiment of that concept. He helped countless others. His life was a gift to the world. I miss you, David.
Thank you again for those wonderful words. In many memorial services in the United States and in a Christian tradition, there is an opportunity to share a passage from the sacred text we call the Bible, and to have some reflections on that. I personally think we've had some wonderful reflections on the deep truths of the Judeo-Christian scriptures. But for a few moments, I'd like to just take some time to read a passage that was chosen and perhaps reflect on that as it relates to David. And the passage comes from the book of Revelation, a very contentious book, actually, in our day, chapter 21. And let me read that particular passage. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and she will dwell with them. Then they will be her people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eye. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." She who is seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." Then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life." You know, I am really fortunate to have this opportunity to reflect on David's life, actually, through the lens not of death, but of life, or a fractal of the life of God, bestowed on all of us for just a moment in the flow of time. A few days ago, Corinne and I were actually talking about how to title the program. And I mentioned actually a common bulletin title, celebrating the life of David Scott. But Corinne pointed out how celebration of life for David Scott, the current title, had a richer theological nuance. We were not merely celebrating the life of David Scott, as we can tell here. We were celebrating life as it took shape through David, and I loved that profound but subtle difference. So we actually come to this time, the celebration of life, and how that life was manifest for 85 years through the prism of David Scott. The fullness of life, as we all know, reaches far beyond the human species. It has no national boundaries, religious borders, or theological and political constraints. And it is forever blowing across the waters of our planet, inviting everyone in every age to come and taste and see the goodness and the fullness of life. And David Scott was a person, a visionary really, who held to an expansive view of life, who saw the permeableness of boundaries, borders, environmental ecotones, and theological walls. He lived beyond the exclusionary myopia so common in our world, considering the world as his neighborhood. But his home, as has been mentioned, is elsewhere, beyond our material reach, beyond the constraints of time and space, where the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, complete their circle that flows into the springs of living water, where death is no more. Yet before we complete our circle, a gift is given to each one of us who chooses it, and that is to desire more. A thirst for more, a thirst for what is good, a thirst for what is true, is just, compassionate, merciful, and kind. that if those are sought, will lead us to the river where the springs of plenty flow and satisfy all of those who are hungry for those. And I'd like to suggest that water is actually an interesting metaphor in biblical thought. It has a lot of different things. But in this apocalyptic passage in Revelation, the largest bodies of water were called seas. And if you notice closely, seas pass away. For in Jewish apocalyptic literature, seas are not actually what one goes to for a vacation, a getaway, a retreat on a Tahitian resort. Seas are symbolic of all the forces of darkness and chaos. And in Genesis 1, the eternal Spirit hovers over the waters, an empty, dark, chaotic, watery expanse, and brings forth light. And in that same tradition in prophetic literature reminds us that the wicked are like the tossing sea that cannot be quieted, and its waters toss and bring up dirt and mire called divisions, lies, and deceit. But here in this apocalyptic image, John the Apostle gives us a vision of hope. Hope beyond the world's grief, be it the anguish of disease, incalculable variations of loss, to the suffering inflicted as the symbolic apocalyptic horses gallop through time, unveiling conquests, famines, displacements, natural disasters, and environmental degradation, all the products of the powerful with hardened hearts. And that vision of hope is the crescendo of time where the seas no longer roar and chaos is no more. And the holy city, which is not bricks and mortars, but of a humble people, like a bride joined to the Eternal One, her partner, in a world where the two shall dwell together and sit at the table of plenty for every tribe, nation, and tongue in peace. And so one of the collected proverbs in the Solomon's Proverbs reminds us that without a prophetic vision, the people perish. Prophetic visions like this one are designed to stretch our horizons toward true north, lest the end of the proverb continues, the people cast off what is good and do whatever is right in their own eyes. And so David lived his life within that ancient prophetic dream, often called the realm of God, unconstrained by human divisions, higher and wider than U.S. boundaries or border crossings, larger than Christian boundaries, Hindu-Muslim divides. David understood that God's parish to be the world, and that he had a vision, and it was in that vision, in the essence of who he was, that he dedicated his life, that all people from every tribe and tongue could sit together in peace in a table of plenty. A vision for an inclusive welcome, taught all along the highways and byways of life, dismantling the illusions of exclusivity so that the meek and the humble, the peacemakers, and the seekers of all true, that are seeking for all truth in all walks of life, could sit down at that table. David had a vision that religion, in all of its cultural applications, could transcend the downward pull of hate and dogma and rise to the highest law of love for the one who brought light out of chaos and calls us to care for our neighbor. And it was that same vision, written by a modern-day visionary, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, when he wrote, "Goodness is stronger than evil, life is stronger than death, and victory is ours through a God who loves us." David's life narrowed with health issues, as we all know, in the last months. But he was not blind to the challenges in his home countries of America and India. But he always, every time I had the opportunity to see him, seemed to be that he had this lens of hope. And like my daughter's description of the tiny, tiny shrimp phosphorescence that illuminated the dark waters of a Puerto Rico inlet, it was like David was a phosphorescent light of the great light that is at work even now to bring goodness out of evil, to bring reconciliation amongst people until all things are new and death will be no more. May we too stay connected with David as we participate in the phosphorescent choir for light and life. Amen. And now, as we are preparing for some tributes by video, and I trust that you will just really love these. I've seen them. Do you want the lights down? Oh, just if somebody's in the thanks, James, and for a time of tributes from people who couldn't be here this afternoon.
David and I go back a long time, almost 8 decades in fact, back to 1942 at Woodstock School, perched 7,000 feet high in the Himalayas. I was a kid who had just joined Woodstock, and I was very new to its American ways. And David Scott was an enviable prototype with his smart brown jacket and what I seem to remember as chewing gum bulging out of one cheek. Where I came from, gum was still waiting to be discovered. So David was cool, though that word was not yet in our vocabulary. In later years, David would emerge well beyond cool. His quiet confidence reflected a center that seemed at peace with himself and his world. And what a world our community shared with David. Our Woodstock community was a unique mix of a Himalayan hillside with its ancient memories, a subcontinent living through turbulent times, an extraordinary mix of communities, beliefs, and influences from many parts of the world. The Woodstock community then, as now, was no ordinary community, and there was nothing ordinary about David. He would be as much an Indian, as much an American, as much a confident citizen of the world, building bridges of understanding wherever he went throughout his life. In this, he would be joined by Corinne and their sons, together helping us to understand what it means to care for each other as we care for the planet that shelters us. David's Christian upbringing and endeavor was never exclusive. Finding the truths that unite humanity was David's mission, his gift. And his quest would be challenged by so much that we have all had to endure over these past turbulent years. Yet David never lost hope, nor his belief in the goodness of his India, his America, and his world. One symbol of David's extraordinary range of interests was his passionate devotion to the Christian art of India, and in particular to the art of Frank Wesley, an artist whom he admired hugely and who, like David, believed in a humanity that transcends narrow definitions of place, belief, or upbringing. That is the faith that lives on in the memory that we carry of David, that cool American kid high up in the Himalayas, and that wise, compassionate global citizen at home across the world. Rest in peace, dear friend.
I am Jane Downs-Walbrown, and I've known David Scott since I was 9 years old when I met him at Woodstock. We have been dear friends ever since. To me, David was what is rare to find in life, a friend in the true sense of the word, a good listener, understanding, supportive, gave spot-on advice whenever I asked him. Woodstock was a place where so many of us formed long friendships. I asked our Woodstock class of 1952 what they would say about David. The first sentence from many of the girls was, "We all had crushes on David at one time or another. Everybody liked him. He was kind, even-tempered, a good sport, congenial, fun guy, born leader, friend to everyone." Their words. After Woodstock, our paths crossed on numerous occasions. He came to visit me in my jungle hometown in Tura in Meghalaya. I was his student in his class of world religions at UTC in Bangalore, India. Corinne and David welcomed me into their DC home several times. They offered a roof over my son's head 3 months when he was starting out his life in DC. David and I were heavily involved in Woodstock Council business for several years. David was there for me when my sister Carol was going through her final days in Houston. Corinne and David visited me in my Cape Cod home many times. They came to the Cape for the occasion of my son Sheldon's marriage to a lovely Hindu woman. David performed their wedding ceremony. He really appreciated other cultures, had such a wide range of interests. David and Corinne came to visit me here in Hyderabad in 2017, the last time I saw David. Who would have thought? In a way, it's good that I am here in India, as I am not sure I would be able to make it through such an emotional event. It's hard to say goodbye to such a good man. Corinne, you were fortunate in your husband. Chris, Kevin, Nathan, you had a good model of what it means to be a father. David, I know you were resting in peace. You were a good, good man.
I am Dorothy Yoder Nice from Goshen, Indiana. The privilege has been mine to be friends with Corinne and David for decades. Experience living in India, plus respect for and understanding of interreligious diversity, enhances our bonding. John and I have visited Scots in Bangalore and Washington, D.C., and they have been our guests in Kodaikanal in Indiana. Our ever-engaging conversations focus on interfaith issues, books read, travels or people met, writing projects, even politics around daunting Delhi and D.C. If only I could remind David of how I valued his distinct letter writing, written as if he had trotted into a reader's space. Not a formal student of David's, I learned a great deal from him when he graciously met my requirement for an outside reader for my D.Min thesis titled Dialogue to Foster Interreligious Understanding in 1997. While teaching full-time in Bangalore, he corresponded from halfway around the world via packed email messages. He took seriously the segments that I sent to him, first or revised drafts. An expert on Hindu thought and daily practice, he might call for greater clarity from me, whether suggesting further resources for a theme, noting disparate elements in need of depth, the lack of passion for a given God form being described, or spelling options for Hindi terms. David pointed them out. His counsel helped me improve my thesis in distinct ways. Himself disciplined, he ever complimented me for a shift from the mundane to the cosmic, or for my feminist take for interfaith relationships. David's published writings on interreligious issues has also mentored me for decades. Living most of his life in India, religious pluralism is authentic for him, and with that feature, I resonate. Something of the breadth of content about which he writes has amazed me. From an early article that explained dialogue to defining religion itself, from describing baptism in India to marking imagination within pluralism, from honoring both Christian and Muslim awareness of God to divulging his first meeting with Holy High, or from poetic details of Radha's erotic play to P.D. Devanandan's theology. That David gifted me a copy of his colleague Selvanayagam's Christian-Hindu comparative study titled Christu Bhakti and Krishna Bhakti, for which he wrote the foreword, remains a fond memory.
In a context where religion is used to propagate hatred, we remember people like David Scott, who spent all their life to promote harmony of religions with gratitude to God. I remember walking down to UTC as a student from a very fundamentalistic background. Dr. Scott opened my eyes to see the world of religion with new perspectives. He sent us to places of worship of other religions and asked us to do short reflections as assignments. He asked us to meet with people of other faiths and understand the history and content of their faith systems, how significant religion was for them, and how significant is religious practices for them. The time that we spent with Dr. Scott, understanding the essence of living religions and the history of religions, would never be forgotten. It helped us to form respect for other religions, sensibility and sensitivity to appreciate people of other faiths, and also helped us often to have a code of conduct in the way we do mission and a sensitivity in the way we preach to a pluralistic context. For the understanding of religion from a broader perspective, we are so thankful to Dr. David Scott. And now that he has completed his earthly sojourn and has reached his heavenly abode, we thank the Lord for such a precious life. We also thank the Lord for Corinne and Scott as a couple. For us personally, I remember immediately after marriage visiting them. They gave us a wonderful cutlery set which Molly and I still cherish. It was a symbol of hospitality. Your home should be an open home where all people, irrespective of their religions, come and experience the warmth and love of a Christian home. Thank you, Dr. Scott, for who you were in our life. And Corinne, our prayers are with you. And to the family, may God bless you for being the family of such a wonderful human being. God bless.
Good afternoon. It is such an honor to remember Professor David Scott and participate in the memorial service from the Northeast India. Thank you, Corinne, for the invite. I want to begin by extending our deepest sympathy to Corinne and family. As a former student of Professor Scott at the United Theological College, Bangalore, 26 years ago, I have many fond memories of Dr. Scott. His keen interest in the life and work of his students and his gentle yet passionate commitment to the weak and the vulnerable. In Dr. Scott's informed engagements with the reality of diverse cultures, I noted a Methodist who took surely the world as his parish. I also recall Dr. Scott and Corinne's interest and hospitality to students from the Northeast, far from home. Within the religion department, Dr. Scott's expertise was Hinduism, but he shared intellectual hospitality and was gracious to advise students who pursued tribal, indigenous, and Adivasi religious traditions. The religion department of Senate of Serampur University would be the poorer if Dr. Scott did not shoulder the responsibility of supervising the many doctoral students. In fact, it wouldn't be incorrect to say that many senior professors in the area of religion in Serampur University have been guided by Dr. Scott at some stage of their research, either at the master's or their doctoral studies. Today, as India continues to pursue a more aggressive path by the powerful, Dr. Scott, with his heart for respectful dialogue between different cultures and religions, would want us to continue to pursue rigorous studies that enhance dialogue and mutual understanding. May Dr. Scott's memory and faithful service to theological education in India and to a certain extent to South Asia continue to bear fruits for the sake of Jesus Christ, who inspired Dr. Scott and in whom he now rests in eternity. Thank you.
Dear Corinne, we met you and David in 1995 at the UTC in India. We always will remember the Christmas which we celebrated together with you.
I am also very grateful that I could be your and David's student at the UTC. David radiated an incredible amount of peace, love, and open-mindedness, which was a special atmosphere for me to learn and grow, not only in an academic sense, but as a whole person.
We remember the welcoming and warm atmosphere in your home in India. Later on, we have fond memories of your visit in Berlin, Germany, and Katherine's and Inken's visit to you in Washington.
David's friendly, generous, attentive attitude was something very special. We often felt that we had known him all our life and even longer.
In his emails, David often used the word shalom. So we say thank you and shalom, David.
When will you open your gifts? Tomorrow morning? That was last week.
And the cake's cut.
When the cake is cut, you'll open the gifts. I see. Oh, okay.
In Seattle, Washington. Maybe exactly.
Because in our family, they were
he has just been from Mexico.
not allowed to open the gifts until Christmas morning. So they used to wake up very early in the morning. And then they would come and wake us up. Come on, get up. It's time to open the gifts.
Are you that's just funny?
And then we say, no. So then we have a rule that nobody can get
Cookie crumbs you make?
No, it's like Sebastian cookies. Oh. You can make that.
That's the best part about the Christmas.
Dear Corinne, members of the Scott family and friends, greetings from Australia on this occasion in which we gather to celebrate the blessed life of David Scott. Prema and I have known David and Corinne for the last 35 years. I was his colleague at United Theological College in Bangalore and at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. But more than that, we were close friends both in India and the United States. Let me testify to how I have been enriched by knowing David as he and Corinne lived among my people in the land of my birth for close to 4 decades. As a missionary, David journeyed respectfully and receptively on the religious crowded pathways of India. David's border crossing was not just a matter of planting his feet on another continent. It was also a pilgrimage of a heart wandering into its desired home, a house with many religious mansions. India is a fascinating interreligious maze. David studied this as an academic, and he walked through it with a sense of wonder and adventure. David taught me to always be open to the surplus of God. As a colleague and friend, David embodied authentic meekness with gifted peacemaking. Deep humility was a disposition he brought to life as a scholar, teacher, and co-pilgrim. And he used humility to sow mutual understanding, reconciliation, and peace wherever he mindfully wandered. Truly, his was a blessed life. Let me end with Jesus' words of assurance in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth, and blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Rest in peace, dear friend David, and be assured of our love, dear friend Corinne.
Just be it for our closing. Corinne's going to come up and just say a word.
It has been a truly joyous experience to share with you in the memories of David during this past hour and more. Sorry for that. But certainly I want to thank all of you for your joining with us and knowing that David's spirit is very much with us and that we continue to celebrate life, and that we have learned through our time together, been reminded of that passion which he felt, and yet which we too now continue to enjoy and explore, that the power of being part of a world enfolding and emerging is the spirit of joy, of love, and of hope. So let us keep that message alive in our lives as we go out from here. I want to particularly thank a number of people who I won't go into all the names, but who helped put this service together, not only with immediate family members and Reverend Lisa Holloway, our pastor, but other friends and so on who contributed so much time and energy, and particularly to Ira Kohlmeister, who has been doing this videoing to make it possible for not only those of us physically present, but from friends around the world to participate in this service and this sense of experiencing and knowing the joy of life. Thank you.
Let's all stand together now, and I'd like to give a commendation, and then we will sing our last hymn for all the saints. And then I think we'll just leave informally, right? Okay. For our commendation. And now, Eternal One, we commit David Scott into your humble hands. May he rest with all fullness and acceptance, freed from all fear and travail. May he be filled to the brim with ecstatic joy, whose form has always been and will forever be love. And if we go, as we go through the days, and we're quiet, we might even hear him breathing. Amen. Now I'm going to change the directions just a little bit. If all of the family, we could head out because it's much more congested up here. If you all can head out these couple of rows out into the foyer, then those who want to be able to talk to you a little bit more might be able to do so. Go in God's grace and peace.